Hello and welcome to our webinar. The webinar itself is all about Unit 1 of the BTEC Teamwork and Personal Development in the Community qualification, and it will take about 20 to 25 minutes of your time. Unit 1 is all about teamwork and communication skills, and these are skills that as cadets you practice regularly and develop throughout your cadet career. Everything you do in cadets, from your regular training, your adventure training to volunteering, all help with your personal development and can build on these skills. The webinar has two key objectives. Primarily, the purpose of the webinar is for me to guide you through Unit 1 and the 7 tasks within the workbook step by step. And secondly, I will provide contact details for the 3 area managers. They will be able to put you in contact with the regional manager who looks after your cadet unit should you have any queries after this webinar has finished. For this session, you will need a copy of Workbook 1 and the Learning Guide to support Workbook 1. You may have those in either a paper copy or as an electronic copy. Just to give you a quick overview so you know what to expect, there are 7 written tasks in the workbook. They will cover teamwork and communication skills, the qualities of good instructors, contributing effectively to team building activities and interpersonal communication skills. This webinar will guide you through those tasks step by step, and I will refer to the learning guide throughout as those resources are there to support you. Task 1 is asking you to identify teamwork and communication skills. You can find the task itself on pages 3 and 4 in the workbook and the supporting material in the learning guide on pages 10 to 14. You may already be able to identify some teamwork and communication skills due to your experiences as a cadet. If you turn to page 12 in the learning guide, there are a number of them listed. Everything from listening skills, problem solving, and cooperation. I'm sure that some of them will sound familiar to you. Let's try and put those skills into context for you. Think about the skills you have as a cadet. Over the years, you will have developed your discipline, your punctuality and timekeeping, and your ability to cooperate with others. These key skills will enable you to progress as a cadet. Another example to help you understand this topic would be to look at the role of a police officer. They would need to be committed, as their job is hardworking and demanding. They would also need to be respectful, as they work with a very diverse community with different needs. Spend a few moments of your time reading through the skills details, and after you have done that, if you can turn to Workbook 1, I can talk you through Task 1. Task 1 is split up into 2 sections. Section A is about a paramedic, and Section B about a firefighter. For Section A, you will need to read the paragraph about the work of a paramedic and identify 4 teamwork and communication skills within the paragraph, and make a note of them in the boxes below. As the command verb is to identify, simply writing the word will be enough. You don't have to describe them or write sentences, just write the 4 skills in the boxes provided. Over the page, you will find Section B, where there is a short paragraph about a firefighter. You need to do exactly the same. Read the paragraph and pick out 4 skills that are mentioned, and then write them in the boxes beneath. Once you've read the questions and completed them in full, Task 1 will have been completed. Moving on to Task 2, we are still talking about teamwork and communication skills, but taking them a little further and using them in 2 scenarios, one related to the army, one to the police. You can find the task itself on page 5 of the workbook and the supporting material in the learning guide on pages 15 to 17. If you turn to the task in your workbook, the scenarios are there for you to read. The first one is related to an army soldier who is taking part in an expedition in a mountainous area like Snowdonia in Wales or the Cairngorms in Scotland. He is with 14 others when the weather deteriorates, the mist closes in and the temperature drops. What you need to do is consider why problem solving is important in this situation. Think about the situation the soldiers are in and the problems they may have to deal with. The weather is closing in. The temperature is dropping. They're in a large group. So why would problem solving be important? What problems may they have to solve? Once you've had a chance to think about this, then you should write in a full sentence why problem solving would be important in this scenario. Then, relating to the same scenario, you would need to consider why listening would be important. What would the soldiers be talking about? What may they have to deal with? Why would listening be important? There is space in your workbook to record your answers. One thing to remember for this question is that the verb is to describe, so you must use full sentences in your answer. Moving on to the second scenario, this relates to a police officer who has been called to the scene of a burglary. When he arrives, he finds a very distressed elderly lady who is in a complete state of shock as her home has been ransacked. You would need to consider why, for a police officer in this situation, respect would be important. Bearing in mind what we know about the elderly lady and what she's been through, why would respect be important? If the police officer shows respect to a victim of crime, in this situation the elderly lady, what would it achieve? Why would it be important? Then the same for body language. If the police officer was aware of his body language, particularly his eye contact and facial expressions, why would that be important in this scenario? As with the first task, there is space provided in the workbook to record your answers in full sentences. One point to note is that some learners joining in on this webinar may have registered on this qualification prior to September 2019. If this is the case, then you will have an older workbook. It is important for you to read the question, as it may ask you to look at alternative skills and why they are needed. Once you've read the questions and answered them in full in the relevant boxes, then task 2 will be complete. Task 3. So moving on to task 3 now, we'll be looking at another area of communication, the qualities of an effective instructor. You can find the task itself on pages 6 and 7 in the workbook and the supporting material in the learning guide on pages 18 to 20. If you were a new instructor delivering a lesson, what qualities would you want to display to your students? When I'm delivering this task, I ask my learners to think about a good instructor they have had, perhaps a teacher from school. What qualities did they have that made them a good instructor? You will need to think of 3 different qualities. There are a few points listed in the learning guide that may help you, for example, confidence or manner of an instructor. But thinking about your own experience is just as useful. You will need to think about each quality and how and why it was effective. I can recall my French teacher who was so enthusiastic, and his motivation motivated me to work and achieve some good results. When you've had a chance to read the learning guide and reflect, turn to task 3 in the workbook. The boxes will guide you through the details required for each of the 3 qualities, but for each quality, you will need to explain how and why each one is or was effective. For this question, the level of detail is important. You will need to explain your answer, so one-word answers or notes won't be sufficient. Once you've done this, task 3 will then be complete. To complete this part of the unit, you will need to show that you have been able to conduct a number of lessons. These might have been in a classroom or outdoors, or a combination of both. This is a practical task that you may have already completed. There's a list of recognised assessments on page 8 of the workbook. If you've already completed one of these, then your regional manager will have access to that information, so you won't need to do anything additional. If you haven't completed one of the assessments, don't worry. Your regional manager can guide you through a small practical assessment at a later date, and this activity can then be signed off as complete. Task 4 gives you the chance to reflect on your own skills and the role you played when you have taken part in team building activities and review how effective you were. For those wanting to follow in the workbook, the details can be found on pages 8 to 10 and in the learning guide on pages 21 to 24. The team building activities that you can review for this task can be those you have taken part in with cadets or apart away from your unit. You can use anything from your Duke of Edinburgh expedition to being in a sports team, to taking part in command tasks or project type work, for example NCS. You will need to choose 3 activities to focus on and review your contribution. Make a note of the 3 activities you've chosen within your workbook, and you will then need to consider the prompts given. One point to remember before you start is that the command verb for this question is to review, so you will need to back up your points with examples to add strength to your answers. Part 1 is all about communication. How well did you communicate with the other team members? You don't need to write about all 3 activities in each question box, but overall. So generally speaking, how was your communication? Was it good? If so, why? Back it up with an example from 1 or 2 of your activities. Part 2 asks you to review the particular skills that you brought to the team. What were you good at? Did you have a particular role? And what did that mean for the team? Choosing an activity here with a specific example will add strength to your review. Part 3 asks you to describe your attitude as part of the team. Did you have a good attitude? Did you have a poor or an average attitude? And what was the impact of this on a particular activity? And the final part asks you to judge your effectiveness in the team. How effective were you? Again, providing a little detail using examples will strengthen your answers. If something didn't go well, please don't feel that you can't include it. Your comments don't have to be positive to pass the task. It is a review of your own personal experience. If you can back your points up, either positive or negative points, then it will provide the review required. Once you've done that, then task 4 will be complete. Moving on now to task 5. We're over halfway there through the workbook, and we're going to look at using appropriate terminology in a given scenario. Task 5 relates to this scenario. For those wanting to follow in the learning resources, this is on pages 10 and 11 of the workbook and pages 10 to 14 of the learning guide. A large tree has blown down in the recent gales and is completely blocking the road. All of the emergency services, the police, the fire and rescue service, and the ambulance service are in attendance, and there is an injured cyclist awake but lying on the pavement. The cyclist, who is deaf, swerved to miss the falling tree, but in doing so has hit the curb and fallen from his bike. Specialist assistance has been requested to help move the tree, whilst a reporter has arrived to write something about the incident for the local newspaper. Quite a crowd of spectators has gathered, some of whom are becoming impatient that they cannot get to work or go shopping. The different professionals on site, so the police, the fire and rescue services, the paramedic and the newspaper reporter, will all need to communicate effectively to deal with this situation. For this task, you need to think about the specific job they need to do and, importantly, how they would communicate with each other. What would be appropriate to say and what wouldn't. For the task in the workbook, there are 4 questions with multi-choice answers, 1 for each person involved. You would need to read the question and the possible answers available and then tick the most appropriate answer given. Once you've done that, task 5 will be complete. The final 2 tasks refer to interpersonal skills and using them to communicate effectively. You can find task 6 on page 12 in the workbook and the supporting material in the learning guide on pages 28 and 29. At this point, you'd need to spend a little time looking at this chart. which you can find in the learning guide, and it gives you a selection of communication methods, for example, talking, emails, radio, road signs, etc. And it breaks them down into the 4 skills areas: verbal, non-verbal, written, and listening. If we were to go through the chart, we could see that written skills could include letters, email, or orders, or the verbal skill area could include talking, shouting, or whispering. Once you've had a chance to look at the chart, task 6 asks you to go back to the scenario and think about the most appropriate interpersonal communication skills that those involved would use. So something from the second column of the chart. We know that the people involved in the scenario would use a range of communication skills, but what would be appropriate to use in this scenario and the role that they are undertaking? The first question asked you to look at the fire and rescue service, trying to organise the removal of the tree. Bearing that in mind, what would be the most appropriate communication method that they would use to achieve this? When you're ready to write the answer, make a note of the method of communication, i.e. emails, talking, shouting, something from column 2 in the chart, and then explain how it would be used in that scenario. There are 3 other similar questions, looking at the communication methods of the paramedic, who's dealing with the injured deaf cyclist, the newspaper reporter, who is interviewing the crowds, and the police, who are controlling the spectators. Once you've answered all 4 questions, task 6 will be complete. And finally, moving on to the last question in the workbook, task number 7, which can be found on pages 13 and 14 in the workbook and in the learning guide on pages 28 to 31. It is still on the topic of interpersonal communication, but this task requires you to think about the effectiveness of the methods of communication. Having the chart from the learning guide to hand will certainly help you. You will be tasked to provide examples of how and when a method of communication can be used, and secondly, how effective it would be. The task itself has 4 rows you need to fill in, although only 2 are shown here due to space on the slide. Column 1 asks you to include 2 pieces of information: the communication skill and the method. An example of this could be verbal and talking. Column 2 asks you for another 2 pieces of information: how and when the method can be used. An example of this could be giving a briefing to a group of cadets. And finally, column 3 asks you for a little more information on the effectiveness of the method. Splitting this into 2 parts would help you structure your answer. Writing down how effective the method can be, and then adding in the reason why. So it is effective because. An example of this would be the tutor speaking effectively and clearly, and the message being delivered would be understood by the cadets. After providing the detail for the 4 questions, task 7 would be complete. So finally, once you have completed the 7 tasks, your workbook will be ready to be submitted for marking. 2 final points from me regarding the workbook would be, firstly, to double check your workbook and ensure that you've answered each question in full before it is submitted. And secondly, to ensure that you complete the front page of the workbook in full, including your name, email address, CVQO reference number and cadet unit, and that you then sign and date the learner declaration on the front page. Having this information completed is key, as it will help us to process your workbook as quickly as possible once we receive it. If you're using an electronic workbook and will upload it to Moodle, the front cover may look slightly different, but the key elements on the front page must still be completed. If you find you have any additional questions following this webinar, then please don't worry. There are a number of regional managers that cover the country and your unit specifically. On the map here are the email addresses of Steve, Andy and Richard, and they will be able to put you in contact with your own regional manager who will be able to help you with any queries you do have. I hope that this webinar has helped you a little more in understanding what is required for each task. Thank you for joining us and good luck with completing Unit 1.